Welcome, everyone. Welcome people online, too. I hear we have about 10 people so far online, so welcome. And a special thanks to the School of Kinesiology and our co-directors, Mark Carpenter, Romeo Chua, for hosting our seminar speaker today. And a special thanks to Jean-Sébastien Blouin, Anita Zhang, and Robert Lovin for their technical and administrative support in bringing Joe and making this happen. So I'd first like to acknowledge that for those of us who are at UBC right now, that we're on the traditional, ancestral, and unceded territory of the Musqueam people, and to give gratitude for the ongoing privilege to work and learn on this land. It's my great pleasure to introduce our speaker today, Joe Baker, from the University of Toronto, where he is the Tannenbaum Chair in Sport Science, Data Modeling, and Sport Analytics. Dr. Baker's research explores the very important question, although I'm very biased here, about how do people become experts in sports. Rather than focusing on talent as something fixed or innate, his work examines how experience, practice, and learning environments shape excellence over time. He is the author of several influential books, including his most recent book, which forms the title of his talk today, The Tyranny of Talent, How It Compels and Limits Athlete Achievement, and Why You Should Ignore It. This book and associated research questions the idea that success is primarily determined by natural ability and provides evidence for why developmental systems, coaching, and opportunities matter. I had a look at his publications, and just to give you an idea of how lucky we are to have Joe speak to us today, I saw that he currently has 11 co-authored publications just in press right now, with 100 articles listed in the last 5 years, which is pretty amazing and often is a career's work for a lot of established researchers. So graduate students, don't be too worried. This is exceptional. I also know that Joe is an avid reader of fiction and non-fiction and can hold a conversation on a broad range of topics, as well as being a runner and triathlete, which, truth be told, was the real reason for his search for talent and subsequent conclusion that it should be ignored. Please join me today in welcoming our kinesiology seminar speaker, Dr. Joe Baker.
I've known Nikki for almost 30 years, at least 28, 29. And it's nice that we've reached the point in our relationship that I'll get an invitation to come to UBC. I've never been to campus before, so this is exciting for me to be here. What a beautiful spot, especially considering the monstrosity that we're experiencing in Ontario right now. I'm excited to be here, but I also like to say to people, especially in public spaces, I'm here to get pushed around. I don't think that I have all the answers in this area. I think after 30 plus years looking at these research questions, I think we're starting to get a handle on what the right questions are to ask. But if you have any challenges to the work that we've done, I think this is an important time to talk about those challenges. And if we don't talk about them, we've missed exciting opportunities for everybody, including myself, to learn and to get better at the way that we think about the world. This is the talk. I think the only difference between what was advertised and what's here on the screen is that special asterisk at the end. And I'll come back to that because I think talent does have a role to play in our understanding of human development and human achievement. I just think it's oversold and maybe not as important in the real world as it is for us in research labs. My goal in my career, I'm getting to the point where I'm starting to look at, what do I want the end to look like? For me, I think if I could come up with a holistic model of athlete development, I would be satisfied because I think there's a need for this. I think athletes deserve it. And I think we have a lot to say about how we do this holistically. And this has been the focus of my work for decades. How do we understand the quality of learning environments, the types of things that we can predict, and more importantly, the types of things that we can't predict. early in my career, and this is why Nikki and I go back so long, is we focused on the role of training and practice. How do we quantify this? How do we, almost from a bean counting kind of perspective, how do we understand the quantity of practice that's necessary? So this is going back to the early deliberate practice days where the focus was shifting in discussions of athlete development to understanding the quality of the learning environment as being the most important thing if we want to understand how athletes develop. A lot of things that we used to just say, well, they've either got it or they don't, or this is a natural athlete or versus this person isn't. We had to throw those arguments out because of the work that was happening in deliberate practice that emphasized that, no, if we want to understand the differences between learners at different levels of skill, the most important variable is the quality of time they spend engaging. Importantly, that doesn't mean that there's not a genetic role. Some people like to work hard. Some people like to do things that the rest of us would choose not to do. But it does reinforce this idea that, hey, if you want to get better at something, figure out a way to work harder. So a lot of this early work was on quantification of load, modeling it over time, assessing training environments so that we could understand what's a high quality environment versus one that isn't. More recently, we've started to look at the psychology of practice engagement. If we can understand what kind of a person is somebody who's going to want to spend thousands of hours working hard, sacrificing their Saturday mornings so that they can get in a good training session? Can we understand that psychology that a person might have or a person might start with? And if we can, what's the value of that as a predictive variable? So self-regulation, conscientiousness, things like grit and mindset that you might have heard about. What's the value of these things? Not in understanding the outcome, but in understanding who's going to engage in the process in a better way, in a more high quality way. I learned very early that if we wanted to understand holistic athlete development, we can't stop at the point that they make it to the expert level. Even at the professional levels of sport, athletes continue to develop over time. Consider the differences that you see in a player that's just gotten drafted to the NHL versus the end of that player's career. They can look like different players, and so there's a lot of development that happens in that space. And if we want to design a model that's holistic, we need to understand what happens after they leave their sport, because it's not fair for us to design high-performance training environments that break athletes in ways that they carry the consequences of their sport engagement for the 50 or 60 years that they're going to enjoy in post-sport life. So how can we help them develop the skills that they need to be an optimal performer, but not in a way that's going to damage their bodies too much, so that they're not carrying those chronic disease loads for longer than they have to. So we've looked at how do we manage post-career wellness and health. Are there any situations where being a high-performance athlete is a bad thing for your health? There are certain circumstances, but if you look at them as populations, even players that are in the NFL, where you'd say that's pretty risk averse or a pretty risky environment, even NFL players have a longer lifespan than the average person in the American population. So even in that sport where we would say there's high risk, they do live longer than the average person, but of course they're probably carrying all kinds of arthritis or other comorbidities during that time. We did a lot of this work, and it's interesting, probably about 10 or 12 years ago now, you know, the real takeaway message from the work that we've done and Nikki's lab has done has been on the quality of the training environments. If you want athletes to do better, you need to design better learning environments for them. But when we were talking to coaches around the world, they all wanted to talk about talent. How do we identify it as early as possible? What do we look for? Tell me what the holy grail is for predicting this outcome. And so rather than sort of skirt around this issue, our research group decided we were going to go straight through it. And that's what I want to talk about today, is this idea of talent. We've looked at ways that we can identify it. We've looked at how well can we model it or forecast it over time. We've got a really cool research program at the moment that looks at the psychology of coaches' brains when they make a selection decision to try to understand the process that they go through to end up with choosing this athlete versus that athlete, so that we can help them do that better with better data, with better psychology. But essentially what we're trying to do is really unpack this idea of talent. So I want you to consider this question. A parent or an athlete comes to you, wants to know whether their daughter or themselves has talent. What's the variable that you immediately go to? Most people, when you ask them this question, they go to something physical or technical. They're a good mover. They got the right anthropometrics. They look like an athlete. They look like a hockey player, whatever it is. Eventually, we would get down to psychological characteristics. We've got killer instinct. They've got grit. They've got mindset. But what's interesting, and we've done this with a number of coaching populations around the world, is we very rarely get people to agree at first blush what those variables are. There's a lot of variability in what this is. So part of that variability is a problem for us, because if we can't agree on what it is we're looking for, then it's really hard to design assessment and evaluation strategies. So our first question is, what is talent? What is this thing that we're trying to capture? I think we need to make a distinction between talent as a scientific concept, which is essentially people vary, and sometimes those differences between individuals affect their likelihood of success. Okay, so if your estimated height is 7 feet plus, then you're advantaged in sports where height is important and disadvantaged in sports where it's not. Okay, if we thought about talent in that way, and most variables that we've ever measured at a population level vary on that sort of normal distribution curve. If we use that as the basis of what talent is, variables range on a normal distribution. Sometimes people at the high end of that distribution have advantages that others don't get. If we just agreed that that's what talent is, I think I could probably convince you of that. People differ. Sometimes those differences matter. That's different from the way that we think about talent in practice, though. Talent in practice, the things that a coach has to do is to take something in the here and now that's got a long-term predictive utility for the outcome of interest. Who's going to be an Olympic performer? Who's going to be a professional athlete? Those kinds of things. That's a fundamentally different question. Okay, and I'll give you a couple of examples. Some of you may have seen this before. This is an 18-month-old from the Netherlands named Berke. And think about what's happening from a motor development standpoint at 18 months. We're just starting to see the arms drop. You can see this in Berke here. Just starting to see stabilization of motor patterns. And so if you compare what we're seeing with Berke here to what we normally see in an 18-month-old, this is amazing. This is remarkable performance of an 18-month-old compared to other 18-month-olds. Less impressive maybe is signing this 18-month-old to a 10-year contract at a football club in the Netherlands, which is what happened. This is the most extreme case of talent identification we've ever seen, but this is what they call the race to the bottom. How do we get kids into our sport as early as possible so that we can help them under the assumption of how do we help them succeed? Here's another example. This is a little bit closer to home. This is Olivier Rioux. This is Olivier at 13 years of age. Olivier's from Quebec. He's playing against other same age peers in his grade 8 high school basketball competition. Here we have a different talent identification problem. Both of those, if you look at them relative to the peer group that we're comparing them against, they're both remarkable situations, but we have two different talent identification issues. One is, what is your performance as an 18-month-old? What's the relevance of that to the thing that we're interested in later on? The more important question with Olivier is, what's he learning here? Is he learning anything of value in this context? He's learning that I don't have to try real hard. This is easy for me. You know, what you can't hear is the trash talk he's giving to his little friends in this situation. So not only is he maybe mismatched in terms of the right environment that he needs for his own development, but he's probably undermining the needs of the other people in that environment through the way that he's trash talking and behaving. Okay, so we've got two different questions here. So one is, what's the predictive long-term value of early performance? And the second one is, how do we match the needs of the athlete with the environment that we put them in? Two totally separate things, but that's what coaches have to make decisions on when they wrestle with this issue. So why does this matter? Well, for us, I think we need to be focused on what talent means to practitioners. What does it mean for coaches? How do they think about this problem, and how do they respond in their own behaviors to reinforce maybe messages that we don't want them to reinforce? I think the notion of talent for people like me who write models and theories and papers on what talent means for understanding human achievement in general, I think that's a great way of talking about the differences between individuals that matter. Talent, I think, is a real thing. But if you ask me how to operationalize it or to give you the keys to the kingdom, I can't do that. And so I think when we focus too much on it as at a practice level, we actually undermine the qualities that we're trying to develop. I think it has limited value for practitioners, and we focus on it too much. That's my asterisk at the beginning, or the title slide. Talent is real. Talent is a thing that helps us understand humans, but don't ask me how to measure it, how to look for it, how to model it, or how to predict it. Okay, we're done. No. What I want to spend the rest of the time talking about, though, is the consequences of the way that we've designed sport. These are some examples of extreme talent identification in just a single sport, soccer. This took me less than 2 minutes to find on Google. This is what talent identification looks like in most sports where there's high cultural interest, high participation numbers. We have gone very extreme in terms of the way we think about getting young kids streamed into high performance programs. A lot of this soccer stuff we don't see in Canada, but we could just as easily done this with ice hockey here. All this to say, the way that coaches and practitioners think about talent has consequences. If we go back to young Berka, think about that 18-month-old signed to a 10-year contract. I can tell you right now that that video was posted in 2011. So Berka's now 16, 17 years of age. If he was still in the Dutch high-performance system, we would know who he is. He would be listed on a website somewhere. He's nowhere. He's in a black hole. So it's hard not to look at that as a failure of talent identification. A failure in the sense that it didn't do anything for high-performance soccer in the Netherlands, but we've also removed opportunities for that 18-month-old to be anything other than a soccer player at that most important phase of their developmental career. They could be the greatest diver on the planet, the greatest figure skater on the planet, but they will never be seen by those sports because we've removed that. And for the first 10 years of their sporting career, he's going to be a soccer player first and probably nothing else second. That's the consequences of talent identification. Providing opportunities, but more importantly, taking opportunities away, especially during early involvement. Most systems of high performance in the industrialized world look something like this. We have a variable, or we have a population of kids that enter our program. Eventually, at some point, we have to make a decision about who gets to move on, a rep team or a traveling team or a high performance squad. We have to make a decision about who gets that opportunity. We choose the kids that are at the far right-hand side of a normal distribution on some variable of interest. Most of the time, it's performance, but we choose them to go on. And this is what talent selection looks like. the variables that we look at, the time when it occurs, the number of steps in the system, those all vary from sport to sport, but this is essentially what the high-performance athlete development pathway looks like. This system assumes that athletes need to be identified and streamed. If we don't find them, they won't find us. It assumes that the system is good at this process. You'll see some numbers in a moment to show how many people are removed at each of these selection steps. And it assumes that the variables that we're interested in vary on this normal distribution. And we can call this the standard athlete development model, or the SAD approach. And the reason it's the SAD approach is a fitting acronym for this model is not because it doesn't end up being capable of producing elite performers, because obviously they do. We're seeing some of them in Italy right now. But it's what it does to the most important resource in our system, which is interested people, interested young athletes who want to stay in our sport. So I'm going to show you some data here from basketball, which is the most extreme example that we've ever seen in terms of participation numbers. But proportionally, most sports with high-performance systems will have a similar sort of proportional change in the population as you move through the system. So in any year in the United States, there's around 3.5 million boys playing in basketball programs at the primary school level. If you want to go on in the NBA, you almost always have to go to a high school that has a basketball program. In the U.S., there's 18,000 of those, and they're in a single selection step, we've gone from 3.5 million kids to just over 500,000 kids. If you want to go on in the high-performance development system in basketball, you have to go to a college that has a basketball program. There's 19,000 players in college basketball in the U.S., but really you have to go to a Division I program, and there's only 4,500 players at that level in the United States. From there, the NBA has a 2-round draft system. Unlike baseball and the NFL and the NHL, NBA controls the amount of variance in the players they select. They only have 2 rounds. And of those, they choose 60 players to move on in the NBA system. And of the 60 that are selected, a large number of them go on to play in the NBA. Most of the players that are drafted in the NFL, NHL, and Major League Baseball don't even play a single minute at the professional level. But the NBA does, because they control who they get to, who they even select. The reason we call this the SAD approach, though, is because in 2 selection steps, we've removed the most important resource in our system. The odds of a pre-high school player making it to the NBA is 1 in 70,000. Which is, these are just numbers, they don't mean anything, but when you put that kind of pressure on the system, you better be sure that you're choosing the right one out of that 70,000 to be the best bet for your system, because you've constrained the development of everyone else through those selection activities. So over the last 10 years or so, we've been looking at the accuracy of these decisions, and what we found is we're not as good at this process as we think we are, and certainly not as good as we need to be to have a system that has such high cost so early in development. So the logical question is, why are we so poor at identifying these things? And I think the most important question is, let's acknowledge how challenging and difficult it is to predict a person's future. There's a reason we don't do this in the education system. We don't choose at grade 5, you're a scientist, you're a garbage collector, you're working at a fast food industry for the next 60 years. But in sport, we make decisions that constrain opportunities for development in athletics. So the process, the complexity of the outcome, I think is really important to acknowledge, because we don't want to put all the blame for this on coaches. Coaches don't want to make these decisions, but they live in a world, in an environment where they don't have unlimited resources. Sometimes that's opportunities for development, who gets to go to junior nationals, who gets to go to Canada Games, those kinds of things. But really the most important resource that we underutilize is coaches' time. We don't have enough high-performance coaches to be able to let every athlete that deserves and needs a coach have that kind of time. So let's acknowledge that talent is a complicated and complex phenomenon. Complicated in the sense that there's a lot of moving parts, and complex in the sense that we don't understand how these things evolve and change over time. Of course, talent is physical, but it's not just physical. We can't distill it into a single indicator or measure. In education, we try to do this with intelligence, right? It captures enough of differences in cognitive function that we can use it to predict science outcomes, math outcomes, English outcomes. We don't have the equivalent measure in sport to be able to say you're going to be great as a soccer player or as an ice hockey player or a diver. It's physical. Yeah, but it's also mental. How do we help someone acquire the skills to be able to handle the pressure of what athletes are experiencing in Milano Cortina right now? How do we give that to somebody? What's the time course at which we help them acquire those skills? And it's not just mental. How do we help them handle the psychological burden of a high-performance athlete lifestyle? Most people don't understand the regiment and the constraint that's placed on a high-performance athlete. Imagine only eating the same kind of food for the next 10 years. Never being able to go out and just binge on junk food during your competitive season. Not being able to go out with your friends on a Friday night and go wild because you got to get up early the next day for training. Most people wouldn't choose that lifestyle, but high-performance athletes choose it, and some people are wired for that. How do we understand those individuals? How do we help we're going to see this in a couple months in the NHL draft. How do we help a kid who's maybe 17 or 18 years old who can no longer walk down the streets of his hometown anymore because he'll get mobbed by fans? He can't go to a grocery store. He can't go to the movies. Yeah, he's getting millions of dollars, but his life is fundamentally changed. How do we understand that part of the process? And then we have the cognitive elements. How do we understand decision-making, tactical awareness? All of these things are happening at the same time in a high-performance athlete. They're interactive. Some people are more physical. Some people are better decision makers. Some people are more cognitively engaged. We don't even have a single profile that can fit all athletes. To make it even more complicated, they change over developmental time. The things that predict performance in a young performer are completely different than what predicts it in a later performer. Making it even more complicated, performance outcomes are changing over time. So we don't need to understand what would have won in Beijing. We need to understand how performance is going to evolve over that 4-year Olympic cycle so that we can predict what's going to win in Italy or what's going to win in LA in 2028. This is how complicated the outcome is. This is the process that we give to coaches and say, choose your kids for your team. Most of the time we oversimplify this process. Most of the research, and our research group is guilty of this, most of the research that we have in the area looks at trying to understand this outcome, this eventual outcome that we're trying to predict and understand at peak performance. And the people that we look at are peak performers at earlier age groups. So what did an elite U15 look like, a U17 athlete look like? But that's not the right question. The right question is, how good do you need to be at U15? It's how bad could you be at U15 and still make it to the Olympic level? For that, we need to know not just how good are the best players in that cohort, but how bad are the ones that continue. So we need to have more information about lower levels of skill. We need this because to develop predictive models, we need to have variability. If we don't have variability, that doesn't mean your predictors aren't important. It just means you have no variability to predict. And so this variability is important to us because we're trying to understand whether a high-performance athlete's development looks like this, where they're always at the highest level of performance, which doesn't make sense to us from a motivation standpoint. Right? If you're always the best at something, it's not really that motivating for you to continue to work hard to develop. A more adaptive motivation profile looks like this, where gradually the more we work, our competency beliefs increase, and that drives further engagement, which drives further competency. And so we see this gradual improvement over time, which seems to fit more models of human behavior and human motivation. Or, according to most of the models that we've seen with these kinds of complex data sets, it looks more like this, which is an uncoordinated, unpredictable mess. We need this in every sport, because if we don't have this, we have an incomplete picture. That noise is important for prediction. Making things even more challenging are biases that are embedded in a lot of our approaches and the primitive brains that we have to tackle something so complicated. These can be biases at the system level. So this is the relative age effect. These are data from NHL draftees. The NHL uses January 1st to group kids into age cohorts. So your U9s, U11s, U13s. They're grouped based on where's your birth date relative to January 1st. So let's say you have a twin brother. One of you is born December 31st. The other one is born 10 minutes later on January 1st. You're put into two separate age categories. In the one age category, your brother who's born on January 1st is the relatively oldest. So every time a coach has to make a decision about who looks more talented, who looks more capable, they're going to be looking at people in that 1 year category, and people that are born near the cutoff date are going to look bigger, stronger, faster, but in fact, they're just older. If you're the relatively youngest in that age group, especially when we start making decisions about talent early in development, an entire year of difference, that's the variability within these cohorts, is a big deal in kids that are young, right? And a 5-year-old, 1 year is 20% of their lifespan. That's the difference between the oldest and the youngest. These things are consequential, and they're decisions that happen early in development, but they end up having long-term consequences. We see similar system bias in socioeconomic status, although it's a little more nuanced than you would assume. Socioeconomic status, at least in some of the data that we've done, is a barrier problem. If you can create or deconstruct barriers to entry, once kids are in the system, at least in the data that we've analyzed from Canada and Australia, once they're in the system seems to do an equal job at developing them, but it's the barrier to entry that's the biggest issue. And then we have geographic barriers. This is some data on what's called the community size or the birthplace effect, which suggests that if you come from a large urban center or a small rural community, you're actually at a disadvantage for becoming a high-performance athlete. Doesn't mean you won't make it, it just means you're at a disadvantage compared to people that come from smaller suburban communities. Suburban in this sense is, it seems like the sweet spot, at least with these data, and it does vary from country to country. In Canada, it looks like the sweet spot is between 50 and 500,000 people, overproducing high-performance athletes. So those are biases at the system level. In addition, we have biases in our how our brain processes information. This is the Cognitive Bias Codex, which is, it's over 200 different biases now that have been identified for how our brain processes information. A lot of these biases relate to how we process risk. We're not really good at processing risk. And if you think about what coaches have to do when they choose one athlete over another, that's a risk decision. And so some of these are going to be familiar to you, but think about how these would apply in a coaching or athlete development context. So the self-mirroring bias, which occurs when you are more likely to surround yourself with people who share similar qualities, characteristics, and values. We see this in the political discussions that are occurring, not just south of the border, but in our country as well, right? We surround ourselves with people that think the same way that we do, which is great for maybe emotional well-being and happiness, but for quality of decision-making is not a great way to set up a structure for assessment and evaluation. The sunk cost bias. Anybody here ever buy a book at the bookstore and you're like, this book is not for me, but I've got to stick it out because I spent the money on it? Or a movie, you're like, oh, this movie sucks, but I got to get to the end. Anybody experience that? Okay, so that's a sunk cost bias. You're not getting the money back if you finish the book. You continue to invest time and energy because you've put that initial investment in. We evaluate players the same way. Players that are already on our team, we think about them more highly than a player that might be coming, even though that new player might be a better performer. Primacy recency bias. Think about an evaluation context where during the first 10 minutes somebody does something really impressive. We think about that player a different way, or if they blow a shot early on. Our memory works that we overvalue things that occur early in our assessment and later in our assessment. The recency bias, if they do something that they were terrible until the last 2 minutes and then they execute something, we overvalue that relative to the overall assessment context. So all this to say, we have an athlete development system that's poorly designed, inadequately understood, and delivered by humans with brains that aren't designed for the task. So how do we get better? It's not by making this simple. It's by embracing how complicated this is for coaches. So what do we do about that? I think there's two important steps. One, we need to improve our knowledge of the selection process, recognize the limits of our current knowledge and capabilities. This starts with fully understanding the implications and risk. Most basketball coaches, when you tell them you're removing 3 million people from your development system by making early selections at the high school level, when you tell them that, the next immediate question is, how do we fix that? That's acknowledging the risk that's implied in the current design. Most of the time when you talk to coaches, talent selection is not a yes or a no question. The people who are obviously the Olivier Rioux of the world, are they so clear that they need to be there? Those are not a challenge. And the Joe Bakers of the basketball world who do not deserve to be there, those are also not a challenge. The challenge is the group of people in between. Right? So the clear yeses and the clear nos are not our challenge. It's understanding that group in the middle. We wrote a paper a couple of months ago that tried to discuss the concept of luck in this whole scenario. That a lot of interviews that we did with high performance athletes, this idea of I just got lucky kept coming up. When we talked to coaches, the number of times they kept saying this athlete ended up there through no fault or no benefit of mine. It was just luck that they did it. And one of the best examples of this was in the Premier League. A coach was talking about in their academy system, they sent out notifications to all kids who did not make the team on a Friday night, and a kid didn't read his email. He showed up on Saturday morning team bus, and the coach was like, well, you're here, I guess, come on. He now plays in a Division I Premier League team. How do you predict that? You can't. And so many of these things that we talk about, what part of the year are you born? What community did you grow up in? What are the socioeconomic status of your parents? Were you lucky enough to be childhood friends with your coach's son or daughter? Like these kinds of things that end up having consequential effects on an athlete's development are impossible for us to capture in simplistic models. So this distinction between are you a yes or are you a no is actually a really important one, because I think our goal as researchers, as scholars, as people invested in athlete development is not to change or to give coaches ideas of is this person a yes or is this person a no? It's to try to shrink the size of the maybe box for them. That's probably as good as we're going to get. From a predictive standpoint, should we provide more opportunities for as many kids as possible? Absolutely we should. But until Sport Canada or the national government backs a dump truck of money up to the sports system and says, build facilities everywhere, train coaches as much as possible, support parents so that they can diversify and increase the amount of sports that they put their kids into. Until that happens, this is probably what we're stuck with. Another thing that we could do is reduce the effect that selection has on an athlete's development. The reason early selection is so consequential is because of the way we've designed our athlete development system, so that if you're selected, you get a different kind of learning environment than if you're deselected. If we remove that effect, the effects of selection wouldn't be so consequential. So how do we do that? One, better treatment of athletes who are deselected. Okay, I recognize I'm the dinosaur in the room, but when I was in high performance sport, your coach posted a page on the bulletin board and you found out if you were on the team, because if your name was on the list, you were on the team. If it wasn't on the list, you were cut. Anybody have that kind of experience? Okay, we can do better than that. Right? So maybe we design it more like a report card where, you know, and increasingly athlete tribunals at the high performance level, coaches have to justify their selection decisions against external criteria. We could say, you know what, for our team, these are the things that we were looking for. Here are the ones you met. Here are the ones that you need to work on. Here are things you could do in the off season. I hope I see you next year. That's powerful in two ways. One, it provides feedback in terms of learning priorities for that athlete. And most importantly, it changes the agency of that decision from the system and the coach to the athlete themselves, right? I could have been a great soccer player, but my coach said I had to give up Saturdays. I didn't want to do that. I wanted to hang out with my friends. So I'm going to still watch soccer. I still love soccer, but it didn't ruin that experience for me. We can do better than just, you're cut, see you later. Another thing we could do is develop more approaches to parallel development squads. We're seeing this in future teams, next generation teams, where it's not a you get everything and everyone else gets nothing. Let's treat that maybe group to a little bit better quality coaching environment. We're going to have the best coaches go with the A group, but the second best coaches go with the B group or the C group. So it's not a all in or all out. It's more a division of resources so that we can hedge our bets on who is more likely to be successful in the long term. It gives more opportunities for kids to stay engaged. And most importantly, we shift from identification, as if this is an equation we're trying to solve, to development, which is a process that we're trying to foster and nourish with each individual athlete in our care. When we do this, we provide more opportunities for athletes to develop. What I want to do now, though, is shift a little bit to talk about some of the current projects that we have underway in our research group that relate to how do we unpack this idea of talent a little bit more. And the great sort of thing about the research group that we've developed at the University of Toronto is the number of external partners that we're able to work with. And a lot of times this is because we don't come in saying, we have the answers, you're wrong, don't do this. It's tell me what your need is. How do we help design a data strategy so that we can help do what you're doing? It always comes from that sense of co-creation in terms of solutions. At the moment, we're working with the Queensland Academy of Sport. Australia's got the games in 2032, and they have the most aggressive talent identification strategy happening at the moment. We're working with them to assess and stimulate the kind of data collection that they're doing. the interesting thing about Australia is their approach to talent identification is not what are the things that we need to measure to create the perfect predictive algorithm. It's what would be the effect of providing kids with more opportunities to develop. So their goal, Queensland is a gigantic state in Australia, their goal is to take resources to kids in rural communities and see what they would be capable of doing. So they do a battery of physical tests to see, you know, sort of measures of physical capabilities. But if you meet the requirements or you meet the threshold, they fund you and your family to come to Brisbane for 3 months to try out training at the high performance environment. So it's about providing opportunities to kids that wouldn't have those opportunities otherwise. Importantly, it's not a talent identification system as much as it's a talent transfer system. So if you're a swimmer and you live in Townsville, a smaller community in northern Queensland, you can't be chosen by swimming. If you were a good swimmer, swimming should have found you already, but you could be chosen for water polo or for triathlon. And so it's about providing more opportunities given the limited resources. So they get a 3-month ability to stay and work in the high performance environment in Brisbane. And then at that point, they get to choose whether they want to stay or not. The family makes the decision if they've shown enough progress, obviously, which is a different approach to talent identification and the one that we're interested in. We did an interesting project with them on bias and their data, and what we found was that if you were a kid coming from the rural part of Queensland, you had to have performance that was an entire standard deviation better than a kid coming from the city area in order to be selected to the program. That's the size of the bias that a coach will put on you to justify taking you as a rural athlete. And so what did we use that for? Well, now we're adjusting our model so that rural kids aren't disadvantaged in that same way anymore. So this is the kind of cyclical relationship that we're having with that organization. Another project that we have with the Texas Rangers at the moment is looking at the data-rich environment that professional athletes find themselves in. We were at the MIT Sloan Data Analytics Conference a couple years ago, and they had a panel on data use in Major League Baseball. And there was a Hall of Fame, I won't say who it is, but a Hall of Fame batter was up on the stage, and he was saying, boy, I wish I had all the data that players have these days, because I would have been an even better batter. And my research colleague and I looked at each other and were like, no, you wouldn't. That's not how your brain works when it processes information. And so there's this assumption in sport analytics that if you give people more and more and more data, they just get better. But we know that there's a threshold of which data has value. And so it's the way it's presented, it's the amount of detail, it's the timing. And so we have a project with them to try to figure out what the best way to present the data is and when for people as they go up to bat. And then we have a project with Tennis Canada that looks at the development of a multidisciplinary assessment battery, similar to the categories that I showed you earlier, but not from a diagnostic perspective, more from a prescriptive perspective. So if you're a 13-year-old and you've got great physical skill, but you're not moving on the court well enough, so these are the drills that your coach needs to give you to help you fill that gap. So it's more around what are the things that we would expect to be seeing in these athletes at this age group, and then if they don't have it, not cutting them from the system, but designing a coaching strategy around filling those needs. The last thing I want to emphasize is me singing for my supper here. I'm lucky that almost 3 years ago now, I moved to the University of Toronto after 20 years at York. I thought I was going to end my career at York. I was happy to do so. But they started a really cool and interesting initiative at U of T. This Tannenbaum Institute for Science and Sport is founded on a vision of increasing the scientific data that's used in high performance sport for the benefit of all, not for the benefit of Canadians, not for the benefit of, Tannenbaum's team, the Maple Leafs. No, it's everyone. It's got a mandate of open science. It's got a mandate of universal collaboration. And so I wanted to spend a little bit of time talking about this because most people aren't familiar with what it does, and it might have implications for the way you think about the future. So this was established in 2022. It's a partnership between the Faculty of Kinesiology at U of T, but also the Faculty of Medicine and Sinai Health. Its vision is to become a world-leading, they say the world-leading, I think a world-leading is more appropriate, high-performance sports science and sport medicine center of excellence. And the key initiatives, which is what I want to present to this group, every September we have a conference. It's an applied sports science conference where all domains are in the same space. So you hear from the brightest minds of neurosurgery when they have to do work with athletes like the Blue Jays and the Maple Leafs. What are they doing? And they talk about it from the sense of why do sports scientists need to know this? Why do athlete development specialists need to know this? It's a very knowledge sharing, very sort of comprehensive and integrated discussion. There are research grants. The call for letters of intent for the Tannenbaum Research Accelerator Fund is the end of March. These are funds, $60,000 a year for 2 years, that can go to any project in applied sports science. The only stipulation is that you have to have a connection with somebody at U of T. And if you need a connection at U of T, email me and I can tell you who the person is that you should connect with. That's as simple as it is. And this kind of funding for high performance sport has not existed in Canada for a very long time. And then finally, something that we're developing for later this year is what we're calling the Tannenbaum reports, which are essentially, have you heard of Cochrane reviews? Which are the reviews of science in an area so that you can provide a clear sort of state of the science synthesis of information. We're modeling these reviews on that same sort of approach, but only half of the review is the synthesis. The second half is the application. What does this mean for coaches? What does this mean for practitioners? So biobanding is one that we're toying with at the moment. What is biobanding and why do coaches need to know about it? That's the kind of thing that we would write for one of these reports. That's it for me. Valentine's Day is coming up. If you're looking for that gift for the special person in your life, may I recommend the Tyranny of Talent? No, in all seriousness, like I said at the beginning, I'm here to get pushed around. If you have questions now or you're riding your bike home and you're like, oh, I wish I'd asked this, I love to have these discussions. We had a great discussion with Nikki's lab right before this. This is fuel to me because I don't, like I said, I don't think I have the answers, but I'm really excited about the questions. So thanks again to Nikki for the invitation. I'm excited to chat.
Excellent. Thanks very much, Joe. So now let's open it up for questions. Can I please ask you to use your mic if you have a question? I think you just, how does it work? Do you press it and hold it, or just press it once and it works? Yeah. And just so the people on Zoom can also hear too. So.
Hi, thank you very much. It was one of the most interesting lectures I heard in a while. So it was very illuminating and personally relevant. I have one question. You mentioned coaches and you mentioned kids, right? But you never mentioned parents. So don't you think it's a factor? And I'll give you an example. Like our son is playing for Van U. And now they're saying you have to send him to Division 1, which has like important implications, more time. So it's like a family sacrifice, you know, in terms of time and effort and money and siblings. So have you considered this also as a factor?
We have. I think it's hard to talk about everything in a single talk, but the parents one has emerged as something really important. And one of the things that we're trialing that seems to have great success in the groups we've worked with so far is to clarify what the role of the parent is in the athlete development. And so a lot of we think a lot of the issues with parents, especially in sports like ice hockey or soccer, where they try to remove them because they're disruptive, it's because the role of the parent isn't clarified. And so we say to coaches, give that parent a role. They're not there because they're trying to disrupt their kids' development. They're there because they care. And so give them a role. Your role is to be the unconditional source of support. And so here's how I want you to execute that role. I want you to be thoughtful. I want you to be emotionally supportive in the car ride home. I want you to ask the questions. I don't want you to critique the coach because your role isn't skill acquisition. And so if you thought about it from that perspective, and that the athletes develop as part of an ecosystem, then every one of those people that you mentioned has a role. The sibling has a role. The parent has a role, the peer has a role, and it's clarifying what that role is. Most of the time it's support, and here's how you be supportive. But most people don't start out knowing what those skills look like. Yeah.
Thanks for the talk. I just had a question about predicting like athletic performance. Do you think it's a data issue, like we don't have the data, or like an algorithm issue that we can't use the data properly to make those predictions?
I think, for me, I think the first step would be, what amount of variance are we expecting to account for our predictive models, right? And so 100%, no, that's off the board. We did some analysis of the professional drafts in the 4 major sports in the US, and they range in terms of the amount of future games they can predict from between 3% in Major League Baseball and 17% in the NBA. So even if we control the amount of variance in our population by only having 2 rounds in our draft system, the best we can predict is 17%. Okay, if we use that as our baseline, can we get to 20%? Can we get to 25%? We're never going to get to 100%, but can we get a little bit better? For me, that's how I would frame that question. The other interesting thing is most people think that all we need to do is add more variables and get more data. We did another analysis of Sports Illustrated predictions of who was going to be a division winner or a league winner. And we looked at it from, I think, 1990 to 2010. So right across that sort of big data explosion, the Moneyball phenomenon. And their ability to predict the outcome did not change. And so even with these mountains of new data, our ability to predict the outcome doesn't seem to be getting better, which means it's not a data issue. It's a conceptualization of the problem issue.
Thanks, Joe. I was wondering, either in your own work or others, are you aware of any work that's treated selection as more of a dynamic thing rather than static? So in North America, for example, kids, beginning of the season, they've had their 3-4 months off. There's an assessment, you make the team or you don't make the team. Or your NBA draft example, I mean, it's a one-shot deal. Even in pro sports, in soccer, for example, you can make it all sorts of levels. So it's not a one-off, you make it in pro soccer or not. There are all manner of opportunities. And in schools, they might have 4 or 5 teams in an age group if you make the first team, but players can come up. My own school, there are kids that moved up from the 5th team in their first year to the first team by their whatever year. So I'm wondering if there's a matter of maybe looking at systems of selection, maybe treating selection as more of a dynamic process than a very much a static one, which seems to be a very North American thing.
Yeah, and I think the reality is that the system designs that process and how dynamic it is, and so there's a lot of control. If they want to do something better, I think our advice would be try things because nobody has the right answer at the moment. And so even Ontario Soccer, I think, has got a new player development program, which is really neat. Players play with their local club, and then they come to Toronto maybe once or twice a month to play with the development club, but then they go home to their local club, which I think is very positive because if you're a U13 player and you see that guy or that girl that's going to Toronto, you measure yourself against them. They have a role model to play in that situation. So I think there's a dynamic element in there that we could do a better job of facilitating. Some sports, I think the dynamic is built in, like running and time-based sports. It's just the other ones where the selection, the access to the resources you need through selection is so clear.
Do you mind if I just ask a follow-up? So if you take hockey, for example, if you minor hockey club might have 5 teams. There's a selection in August, whatever, you make whatever team. And a simple solution, you see it in a lot of sports, is there's ongoing, not say formal selection, but this player's playing really well. Maybe they give them a chance and they move up. They maybe move up 2 teams or they move down. It seems very peculiar to certain sports and particularly North America, where there's tryouts. I never even heard the word tryouts before moving to North America. And so you either make the team or you don't, and the kids are devastated. Whereas I think one can see it as a more dynamic thing. It's just an ongoing conversation. You provide as many teams as the resources will allow, and then just an ongoing conversation with coaches. And I think naturally you can allow for players to move. But
but to come back to the psychological element of it, like we're working with Sweden and the US with their hockey development system. And the way that Sweden, I think, has the most efficient hockey development system in the world. They have, if you watch the World Juniors, they're always right there, almost at the top level. They have fewer hockey players in their whole country than we have in Toronto. So they do a better job of developing the players in that system. And their goal is we develop good Swedes, we don't develop good hockey players. And so it's a holistic approach. But the thing that we're working with them on is we want to create a division in ice hockey where, in your year, you might spend 20% of that playing up level or 20% playing down, and seeing who thrives in those changes in environments, because right now it's too linear, it's too fixed. And we know that that's a problem. Where it's not happening is in Canada. They don't want to change the system, unfortunately. They're not even interested in having the conversation.
I'll shift chairs. That was a great talk, and I really appreciated the kind of conversation about having more questions than answers right now. It kept flicking me back 15 plus years to NCCP textbooks and learning about the LTAD. And I was wondering how all of these concepts you were talking about map onto the LTAD and whether that still makes sense or if it needs to change. What are your thoughts on that?
I think if you look at what the LTAD was, right, like it was created by sport administrators to help do a better job of allocating resources in the system for different priorities. It wasn't a model that was developed from the data out, it was from the need down. And I think you can see that in the model. If you compare it to Australia's model, which was much more sort of emergent from the data set from practitioners and scientists, they have different priorities. That isn't to say that the LTAD didn't have some interesting things in there. There's some elements that I think continue to work. But instead of, the big challenge with all those models is they're not set up for continued evaluation and assessment and improvement. They're set up to be, this is our framework, use it. Not, we're going to try this and we're going to see if it worked. A researcher would say, we're going to try this hypothesis, and if it doesn't work, at least we get to draw a line through something. That isn't how administrators think about their models and frameworks. So I think we can do a better job if we just change the purpose of that model. And that's a lot of the conversations that we've had with coaches is about, you've got a really tough job. You don't have great tools. Guess what? Nobody in the world does. Here's how we build a better tool for you where you might gain competitive advantage. When you frame it in that perspective, they want to have the discussion. We're not painting them as the villain in that scenario. Yep.
Dying questions? If not, I think we can thank our speaker today, Joe Baker, and thank you very much for your questions as well. Sean, I forgot to ask, was there any online? Any questions? No. Okay, all right. Thank you.